of the essence, and especially Anne's time is of the essence. We know she's in great demand as a speaker and as a wonderful woman in the emergency management and disaster resilience sector. And so we're very conscious of her time, and we thank Anne very sincerely for making the time to be here today. So welcome to everybody. I would like to start our webinar by acknowledging the country on which we are all respectively meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and pay my respect into particular to custodians of the various lands upon which we are meeting also. We know that those custodians play a particular role in caring for country, and as people within the emergency management sector, that's something of course that's very dear to our hearts. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we kick off. I'm going to ask you all to make sure that your microphones are on mute. This will also help with internet as well, and make sure that you're able to hear what Anne and I are talking about, and that your video streaming will be more effective. If you've got any questions for Anne, I'd encourage you to use the chat function. Most of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with Zoom and how to use the chat function. But if you do have any problems, please do put your hand up and we'll sort you out and help you through there. But look, I am really, really pleased to be able to introduce to you the next speaker in our fantastic Australasian Women in Emergencies Network Conversation series. This is a series that kicked off earlier this year as an idea that was put forward by one of our members, and has proved to be really incredibly popular. And I think it's fantastic that one thing that COVID has shown us is that we're able to get together while we're sitting at our desks, sitting in our lounge rooms, or even sitting on our beds, and connecting via platforms like Zoom, connecting from all over Australia, and connecting in ways that where we can learn from one another, develop networks and relationships, and continue the great work that the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network was set up to achieve. I can certainly see that there are people from right across Australia that are with us today, so welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to introduce to you Anne Leadbeater. Now, of course, Anne doesn't need a lot of introduction. Many of you will know who she is. She comes with an absolutely stellar reputation. But just a bit of information for those of you that might not be so familiar with Anne. Anne was acknowledged for her community leadership in recovering from bushfire in the aftermath of the tragic 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. And since then, Anne has become a national expert in leading recovery for communities who have experienced trauma and are seeking different ways to move forward. Today, Anne works with communities who are recovering from emergencies and disasters like drought, bushfire, flood and cyclone right across Australia. And Anne's research has focused on community rebuilding after fire, and how despite a desire for people to be resilient, they can actually be disempowered as part of that recovery process. And one of the things that Anne said that has really stuck with me is that decisions made by outsiders shouldn't be imposed or forced upon a community. Communities need to be able to come to their own decisions in their own time, and that principle is really doubly true of a disaster affected community. And I know that we all couldn't agree more with that statement. Anne was awarded an Awarder of Australia, an OAM, for services to the community following the 2009 bushfires, and she's also a Fellow of the Emergency Media and Public Affairs Institute. But look, that's enough about Anne and her great, wonderful list of achievements. What I'm really interested, Anne, is to find out a little bit more about what makes you tick and what's driven your work in this area over the past, 10 or 12 years in particular. So my first question to you is, tell us a bit about your current role in life, and not just your professional role, but I guess the rest of your roles in your personal life and your community life, and what is it that you love about what you're doing?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm very humbled that there are so many people that have come along to join tonight's discussion, and I welcome you all. I can see some very familiar faces, which is lovely, and some new friends as well, and it's just brilliant. The whole network is a fantastic concept, something obviously that was very much needed for for all of us to feel that we're part of something together across Australia and New Zealand. So just wonderful work, and my heartfelt congratulations to the committee and the organisers of OAR, because it's awesome, and I'm really honoured to have been asked to be part of the conversation tonight. Currently, I am, as you indicated, Bridget, I am working in disaster recovery. Recovery, it turns out, is my jam. It's the bit that I really, really care deeply about. I care about all of the sector and all of emergency across the spectrum, but for me, recovery is where I get to potentially make the biggest difference. And I think that's probably the bit that draws me to that work. And so I have my own sort of little consultancy that I operate, and it's been challenged and kind of expanded, I guess, through the implications of COVID. So it's just such an interesting time, and so yeah, I think that I hope in our efforts to get back to a place where we feel familiar, we don't lose the opportunity that this experience is providing us with. You know, conversations like this, which would have seemed lesser than face-to-face. So I think we're now recognising the value of switching the camera on and actually having those conversations in this rarefied sort of way. But I do love the work that I do. I'm also a wife and a mum of 2 grown-up kids. I'm also an erstwhile sheep farmer of very modest scale, but I'm quite passionate about that as well. And so they're the things that sort of keep me balanced. I have a great many unfinished projects, which doesn't prevent me from starting new ones. And yeah, so that's really who I am. I've been doing quite a bit of work with Red Cross, some pro bono work with Red Cross as a member of the bushfire appeal panel, which has been a real learning experience for me for this year, and also as part of the Red Cross Disaster Resilience Advisors and Mentors Network. So yeah, there's been some really interesting conversations that have come through that, and some great working relationships and partnerships with some terrific practitioners around the country. So yeah, that's what's currently going on. I've also got an ironing pile you couldn't jump over. You know, just probably a bit of yes. There's some things that sort of get more priority than others. So yeah.
Absolutely. I think we can all relate to that, Anne, very much so. And if it's not a pile of laundry, it's a pile of something else. There's always something sitting in the background to be done. Thanks for that, Anne. And I'm wondering, what do you think's been the most satisfying role or life experience that you've had?
Yeah, so ironically, I think the most satisfying started out as the most terrifying, and that was the experience of our community with the bushfires in 2009. When I think back now, that becomes quite a defining sort of point, you know, and it is true for all people who have experienced disasters. We talk about before the flood and after the flood, or before the fire and after the fire, because there's this disconnect with life as we know it, and then there's the picking up of the threads of life beyond the disaster. And so, yeah, I think that really, for me, I think of the time before the fires in 2009 as being quite almost a different life, a different era. And I think I was sort of in a position of providing some coordination and some support for people as we moved through that experience. But I found myself all the time asking myself, what are you doing? You know, who are you to be doing this? Because you don't have a role, you don't have a title, you don't have any of those things. I had a deep and abiding faith in community, and that's about it. So sometimes the most powerful and defining experiences come in quite unexpected ways. And so that experience of working in recovery in my own community really did send me off on a particular trajectory, which I certainly could never have anticipated or predicted. But it's also given me the most incredible privilege of working with people whose best efforts are directed to the well-being and welfare of others. And so that's been a powerful driver, I guess, for where this has all gone. But it's certainly not what I imagined, not what I'd planned, but I'm immensely grateful for all that it has meant.
That's fantastic, Anne, and that really makes me, think about, so many of the amazing women that I know and women in my life as well as women in the sector have taken unusual paths and their paths have led them to unusual places. And so often I hear that this is not where I expected to end up. But what they've brought with them, of course, is that life experience, is that depth and that breadth of experience that then leads them to a place where, they're really just adding extraordinary value. And I think that, your belief and your faith in your community after the 2009 bushfires and everything you've learned since is now, really benefiting other communities right around Australia. So, so your work is, despite the fact that you, may not have a particular title, your work is incredibly valued. So thank you. I'm wondering about some of the, some of the life lessons you've learned that might have guided some of your choices or directed you in some of the ways that you're finding yourself now.
Yeah, it's such an interesting, question. I'm in the midst. I'm literally on day 2 of a 3-day training with the amazing Stephanie Roy McCullum from Canada. And Stephanie's title is Chief Storm Rider. So she's involved in outrage management, and the course that I'm doing is called Brave and Honest Conversations, and it's been quite a great opportunity to actually just sit with some things and think through what are the lessons, what does shape what we do and how we operate and how we work. And I think one of the things that has stuck with me, and I can see Jenny, hi Jenny Beals, and Jenny and I, as we were both involved in working on the recovery in Kinglake, the thing that I almost learnt out of necessity was it's okay not to have all the answers. There's an awful pressure that we feel to be really polished and organised and have everything at our fingertips. And in actual fact, sometimes the best stuff evolves when you don't know what you're doing or you don't know what's going to happen next. And there's an opportunity then to innovate. It can be an uncomfortable and confronting way to work, but I now am much more relaxed about not knowing what's going to happen next. And I think if we can hold a bit of that in the way we do our work, it leaves some space for things to emerge. And sometimes what emerges organically is much more powerful and much more useful than what you might have kind of manufactured, if you like, or caused to come into being. So, I think the other thing that I would always say is that communities know what they need, and they also know what will work. So we don't have to know that, we just have to create the spaces for those conversations to happen. And so that's probably been, there's a bit of a theme there about me not knowing what I'm doing, and I guess I apologise for that. But that, in essence, is a great power in just being able to go with the flow and to take it as it comes, find what's going to suit a given situation. I think that's probably the most important thing. And it is counterintuitive, and you get a lot of pushback. We have to know what we're going to say. We have to know what the problems are going to be before we get out to the community to have the meeting. No, we don't. We can just find out when we get there, and we can listen with empathy and compassion, and we can learn from the people that we're going to be working with, and then we can together make a plan for what needs to happen next.
Absolutely fabulous insights, Anne. And I think your comment on it's okay not to have the answers is a really interesting one from the perspective of a woman. You know, we know that research shows that men tend to be very overconfident in their abilities and their opinions. And, you know, when you stand up in a meeting and I know this and I will do that and this is how it is, whereas women can have a tendency to second guess, to not feel comfortable speaking up and so forth. So I think that's a really great insight that you've got. The other one about, you know, communities knowing themselves and knowing what they need is just so critically important, particularly from a recovery perspective. And I know that in my work at the Victorian Council of Social Service, we often talk about working with different groups of people and working with what they know, and because they are the experts in their own lives. A person with a disability is an expert in his or her own life, knows exactly what his capacities are, what his capabilities are, and what some of his needs might be as well. And it's very much the same with communities. So thank you, that's great. And what's kept you going? And I guess, you know, I can hear a lot of passion around your work with communities and your work for disaster affected, you know, people and families and communities. But what happens when times get tough? What happens when Anne gets tired, when Anne gets frustrated? How do you deal with that?
It's really interesting. Someone's asked me the other day, I was holding forth on something, you know, that back in 2009 we tried this, and then in 2011 this happened, and this person became very quiet and they said, why are you still doing this? And I sort of, it gave me pause. I thought, yeah, actually that's a really good question, you know, and that sense that, you know, that often we find ourselves having the same conversations about the same issues and impacts, and you know, oh, you've got dangerous trees after your fire. Yeah, we had those in 2009 as well. And so there can be a sense of frustration that we observe the lessons, but we don't learn them. And we talk a big game in Australia about lessons learned. We've got, you know, inquiries and IGEM investigations and royal commissions abounding. And all of the information that those types of processes identify is incredibly valuable, but only if we then do something about it. And so my mantra these days, when I'm training recovery practitioners particularly, or emergency management practitioners, if you can't show me what changed as a result of the lesson, I'm going to challenge whether you actually learned it. So I want to see the new policy, the new process, the new relationship, the new way of working, you know, the new doctrine, whatever it is, that's going to really encapsulate the difference that's needed in order to say, we had this thing happen, we did this about it, and this is what we learned. And I think that that's really, you know, that is the quest, isn't it, to try and do justice to what is often incredibly hard-won knowledge. Terrible, crushing, life-altering experience goes into building that body of knowledge. It really then is upon all of us to do something worthwhile with it. So I guess that's sort of the key driver. Sometimes the thing that gets you over the line is something floating back to you that you said, or that you maybe said it lots of times, or you've said once or twice, or someone will come up and say, oh, you said this thing once, and you're never aware of that at the time, that what you're saying is particularly useful or profound or interesting or any of those things. You just, well, that's the case for me. I just say what I say. Sometimes I get into trouble. Gave up caring about that a long time ago. So I have a certain freedom to be able to say what I think, which is a great luxury. But sometimes someone will come back to you and say, oh, you said this thing and it made a real difference, or it helped me understand whatever, or, you know, some sort of feedback like that, which is incredibly valuable, because you don't always know that in the moment. And I think sometimes you don't know what influence you can have until quite a long time down the track. And I guess sometimes you never really find out, but incremental change is the thing that I look for. You know, just the ship turns slowly, you know, and so sometimes you just see that little adjustment in the way things are done and you go, yes, that's great. It's only taken 8 years, but, you know, here we are. So so I think that's really the key motivator, absolutely. Yeah, just being able to, you know, that feeling that what we've learned is too important to lose, and so just, yeah, keep chipping away and trying to see the change.
Absolutely.
And wine, you know, wine helps too. That's also a great leveler. So
I suspect there'll be more than one of us pouring a glass of wine tonight as we sit down in front of our TV and put our feet up after a long day working. And we've had a question come through that said, if you had a magic wand and there was something you could change in relation to emergencies and disasters and how they're dealt with, what would that be?
Oh, that would be a bipartisan approach to emergency management. Now, she says, climbing firmly on, this is one of the greatest challenges that we face in emergency management in Australia today, is an absolute absence of bipartisanship. I really, really would want for emergency management to transcend the political, like that it was so much a no-go zone that no self-respecting politician would wade in, because he or she would recognise that this is bigger than that, and that the stakes are higher than political point scoring. So we've had some really obvious and clear examples of this, you know, in the past 12 months. We're seeing it almost daily with COVID. It's so easy to say, from a position of being in the opposition, we'd be doing a better job if it was us. Now that's fine for political purposes, but what that actually does is cast doubt and concern and additional worry into the hearts of the people who've been affected, that somehow it's not working the way it should. So not only is it not helpful, but it's actually potentially quite detrimental in terms of people understanding and trying to navigate their experience. So that would be my, I mean, there's a list, but that would certainly be at the top of the list. The magic wand list would be to be able to say to all politicians, hands off. This is not your space. You can be helpful, you can offer support and empathy, but you don't get to point score on the back of this terrible experience that people are going through.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can, I think you can really see it playing out in politics in Victoria, you know, in the last week or so in particular, where we're really reaching that point at which, you know, people are very tired, they're very frustrated. It doesn't seem like there's going to be an end to what's happening. But with the politics coming in over the top of that, I think I agree with you. I think it's really detrimental from a community perspective, from a well-being perspective, you know, and let alone from a political perspective. So I couldn't agree with you more.
We end up focusing on the wrong things. You know, we end up focusing on the minutiae of the arrangements, or who said what to who, or who made what phone call and what decision, and we lose what's at the core of this, which is, how is this working for people? How are people, you know, moving through this experience? What do they need? So, yeah, I think we've got quite a lot of growing up to do in that space before we get to a point where, you know, people can feel justifiably confident in the arrangements, because they're not being sort of co-opted, you know, for other purposes.
Absolutely. And I guess thinking about COVID, and you touched on this when you first started speaking, Anne, is, you know, this is an emergency unlike any other really that we've had, certainly in living memory. You know, it's impacting the entire Australian community and Victoria in particular. I'm really interested to know and to hear some of your views on recovery from this and what that could look like.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and one that I've been sort of spending a bit of time thinking about. This is a slow onset disaster. So if we think about disasters as being slow onset or rapid onset, so we have, you know, drought is an obvious slow onset. Cyclones, fires, floods tend to be more rapid. And so the way the impact is experienced is a bit different. Very often the impact itself is very similar, but the way it affects people can be different. The closest we have, I think, in terms of comparison to a pandemic is a drought, and Australia has a lot of experience with drought. The thing that we know about drought as a slow onset disaster is it's very isolating. So people tend to withdraw from social connection, they withdraw from, you know, talking to their neighbours because they internalise the blame or sort of self-blame around drought. You know, I should have responded to the situation differently. So farmers and people who are on the land do tend to be very hard on themselves in the face of what are often unprecedented weather events, weather conditions, but nevertheless they still kind of internalise their responsibility for not having foreseen what was going to happen. I feel like there will be a lot that we can learn from the way rapid impact disasters and slow impact disasters occur and what their effects are in terms of understanding the way we come out of COVID. But I think there's also some other opportunities that we can hopefully mobilise, and one of those is the universality of it. I mean, this is unprecedented in terms of the fact that, you know, usually you have a disaster and it affects community A, B and part of community C, but everyone else is okay. Whereas this has been such a universal experience that I think we'll have a much deeper understanding of what the disruption around disaster actually looks like and feels like, and that may make a difference for future events. I think that all of us crave some sense of control over our lives, and that's often what disaster does, is represents in us a loss of control. If the work of recovery is about helping people regain control, then I think we can see that with COVID as well. You know, we want our freedom of movement restored. We want to be able to reconnect with our family and friends in social settings. We want to maybe be able to get back to the office, whatever that looks like. So I think those things will be quite common to both the traditional sorts of disasters and also for the recovery from COVID. But as I said, I hope we don't lose what we've learned. We won't have to fly to Canberra anymore for meetings. That's just not going to happen. You know, like there's no way that expectation would be, I don't think at least, realistic now that we know what we know, and that is that we can do this stuff really well. And so, and in fact, there is opportunities, and this training I'm doing would be one example. Stephanie's in Canada. We've got people from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and beyond, all doing this training, New Zealand as well. That would be very hard to manage, probably inaccessible for most of us. And here we all are, spending 3 amazing days together. So yeah, I think it's not all bad. You know, there's some really great opportunities here if we know how to take advantage of them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I really like your comparison with the slow onset emergency like drought and comparing it with COVID. I think that's a really great way to look at it. And we know that, you know, some of the impacts of drought are really different to those kind of short, sharp, dramatic emergencies. You know, the impacts of long-term stress on families and on communities and on children in particular, that are witnessing that stress within their family for very, very long periods of time. You know, young people and children missing out on school camps and other things where the family budget's really tightening, and we're certainly seeing a lot of that playing out in COVID right now with such a drastic economic impact as well. And we've got a couple of questions here. Keen for you to expand on community-led recovery. I guess thinking about some of the work and research that's happening at the moment. And I know that there are a number of initiatives across Victoria, New South Wales and other areas. Really keen to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept, community-led recovery. It's sort of like world peace in a way. Like no one would argue against it. You know, no one would say no. They, you know, so on that level, it's uncontested. But the operationalising of community-led recovery can be quite a challenging idea, and especially if you happen to be a member of an agency or an organisation that has legislated responsibility to provide recovery. How do you marry that up or align that with the community's desire to do their own thing or to lead their own outcomes? So there's a real tension to be managed or to be sort of understood, I think. I have in recent times been thinking and trying to explain the potential of community-led recovery as an idea around community continuity. So and thinking about that in terms of the traditional example of a business continuity plan. Most agencies and organisations have a BCP, and so I think if we apply that thinking to community-led recovery, often it becomes easier to think about. So what does this community I'm working with need to be able to get on with its business of being its community? So and that will mean different things depending on where the community is and how it's comprised and how it's sort of structured. So if it's a tourism community, then clearly access to tourism infrastructure and transport, etc., will be integral to community continuity. Whereas if it's a dairy farming community, then access to road transport, feed supplies, milk transport, etc. Those things are going to underpin the continuity of that community. And the reason I guess I'm advocating this is because what can happen in recovery with the best of intentions is that people from outside will come in and start to reimagine the community and start to describe what it should be like, rather than reconnecting with what it was already like, which is what makes sense to those who live there. And so we've really got to be willing to go back before we go forward. So we've got to go back to before the disaster, before we can help to navigate a path forward into the future. And so that idea of continuity is underpinned by a really strong and well-developed working knowledge of the community that you're working with. It's amazing how many people are sent into the wilds to do recovery without even the most fundamental amount of data about where they're going and who they're going to encounter and how the community was working, 2 days ago or a week ago or whatever. So having that working knowledge, and it doesn't need to be war and peace. It can just be, 2 A4 pages of information about what that community looks like, how it works, how it connects, what it's proud of, what its challenges are, what its history and culture and traditions look like. It can be quite a pragmatic assessment, but that really does underpin the ability to support community-led recovery. Without that, you run the risk of coming in and either influencing or misreading or misappropriating, the community's intentions and their priorities. And it's quite hard to do. I remember railing against this, and Jenny will be smiling, railing against the fact that people were rolling up into our community and going, oh, well, we'll put this over here and we'll do. It's like, what? Hang on a minute, where have you come from and who are you and where were you yesterday? We're here and we've been here all the time, so. And yet, when I went up as part of a deployment to the Cassowary Coast after Cyclone Yasi, I remember getting out of the bus at Tully and sort of getting out and going, oh, so this is Tully. And I had to really pull myself up and say, no, this is Tully after a Category 5 cyclone. This is not Tully as it normally exists. This is it after it's had a massive and devastating impact. So really training yourself to not just judge by what you are presented with in a recovering community, but to try and understand what that deeper story, that much more nuanced and complex story about how the community worked before. Because in reality, they were doing fine. You know, they were doing their version of fine before the disaster. And that's really what we want to support, a return to those connections and relationships. We don't have to try and reinvent. We really want to reconnect and re-establish. That's the key.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, couldn't agree more. And I'm seeing an awful lot of nodding heads around the screen, Anne. So, so what you're saying is really resonating, and reminds me of a project I did a few years ago where I visited 2 towns in Victoria, both with very similar socioeconomic and demographic profiles. And we did some consultations with the community and some community organisations in those 2 towns to try and get a better idea about what they viewed were their community strengths and what some of their community's weaknesses might be, from a resilience lens, if you like. And what we found were that these 2 towns were chalk and cheese. You know, one community really identified its strengths as being its sporting prowess, if you like. So it's sporting clubs, you know, very strong football clubs and netball clubs and so forth, as well as a multicultural community that they had there, migrant workers coming in to do seasonal work. The other town actually had quite a different sense of its own identity and a sense of its strengths, and it talked about its tourism, and it talked about its arts community as being really strong. Some of the challenges for that community were people living on very low incomes in public housing and not having relevant supports in place to support them. So, you know, from a recovery perspective, just having that really simple knowledge can help you to go into, say, the strengths in this community are the football club. Let's go and, you know, give them some money to do some community building type of work and to get people together. So it shouldn't be rocket science, and it's not rocket science, but you know, as you rightly point out, it's despite the fact that we know this and research tells us these things, that the recovery systems that we have aren't very good yet at doing anything about it and recognising it.
No, and there's a messiness that goes along with it, and I think that's part of the challenge. That you know, when we're constrained by our time, our budgets, our outputs, our outcomes, you know, all those things, there's a temptation to want to say, well, look, this thing worked here, so we'll just pick it up and we'll apply it over here and it'll work the same. And of course, it rarely does. Sometimes you get lucky, but mostly you get an awful lot of grief because people are saying, why are you doing this to us? That's not who we are. The other interesting thing to note about disaster recovery, I think, is that there is a very strong sense of you know, patch protection, and you know, people become very very focused on their own area. So there's a parochialism that occurs after a disaster, which is very natural when you think about it, but it can fly in the face of some of the work we're trying to do, which is regional, or, you know, all of the Shire, or, you know, whatever. So we can get off on the wrong foot by trying to imagine that we can benefit from economies of scale, when in actual fact people just want to care about their bit. And so I found in that space it's much easier to go with that and to actually support almost and encourage that way of thinking. No, this is just about you and your community. Don't worry about those guys up the road. We'll get to them, but we're talking about you at the moment. And if you do that, then pretty soon the community will start going, well, what are they doing up there? Maybe we need to find out a bit more about that. You know, so the parochialism breaks down very naturally. But if you try and hurry people through that, they dig their heels in and they get very happy about the fact that you're trying to kind of create a more regional or a more sort of jurisdictional approach.
Absolutely. And tell us about the role of the media and what the media could be doing to better support, and what it is that they don't do that actually adds to people's grief and trauma.
Yeah. Well, I've got to say, hand on heart, I love the media. I mean, I don't love being in the media, but I love the work that they do. And I'm very sympathetic to the challenges that they face. And I'm seeing Michelle here on the screen too, who is a member, a director of the Emergency Media and Public Affairs, which is an organisation that I have been immensely proud to be involved in over the last 10 years or so. And the role of EMPA has been to try and bridge the gap between emergency managers and the media, and to try and find the common ground, which I like to think we've been quite successful in doing over the time. The thing with the media is that they have a job to do, and they have a very challenging job, which in more recent years has become incredibly much more high-paced. So the 24-hour news cycle, the advent of social media, and a number of other factors have meant that the need for the flow of information has been more, has put more pressure on emergency managers than at any other point, I think, in our history. And so we often find that there's a tension between what the media need and what we as emergency managers are prepared to provide. And somehow I think we've got to continue to challenge ourselves around, what we can share and how quickly we can share it in order to help the media help us do our job. So we have to think what they need in order to get their job done, and in doing so, they're going to be actually beneficial to us as well. If I can tell you a short story, on the Monday morning after the fires in our town in Kinglake, I was walking across to the CFA shed, as it was then, just a tin shed, and I was approached by a young man in a very clean yellow CFA-looking coat. And he introduced himself as Michael Vincent from ABC Radio Sydney. Now, I worked for local government, and anyone who works for local government will know that only the mayor and the CEO are allowed to talk to the media. Like, that's drummed into you from almost your first day on the job. So Michael said, is there anything I can do? And I just was fighting every urge to say no comment, I can't engage with you. And then I thought, wow, I'm not really sure that the usual rules apply here. It seems like we're a bit off the map, and so I had a chat to Michael, and he seemed like a really straight up young man. And I said, well, look, Michael, this is really bad. This situation that we are in is really bad. And he said, yeah, it's really bad, and I said, well, I really need to understand if you're interested in making it better or worse. Like, what's your motivation? And he said, no. He said, I want to help. I just want to do whatever you need. And so from that point, Michael became our sort of breaking news reporter. And he slept on the floor of the council office for 5 nights. And he would report on, and then I think he went and stayed with other people in the district until, he had to leave. But anything we needed on ABC radio, we would just say, Michael, can you get this on the radio? Yep, sure, and that would just happen. And sometimes I would see him around a corner, like arguing with his producer on the phone, saying things like, I know it doesn't seem important to you, but this is really important information for these people. Like, we really need to get this out, So by taking a chance on him and taking him into our confidence, he was a tremendous resource. And that was a big lesson for me, because often we hear about the media doing the wrong thing, and often they do. But I think when you scratch the surface, very often that is born of a frustration of being not having their role and their validity, and also their capacity to do good actually acknowledged. And I think we need to make partners of the media before we need them. Don't expect to make best friends. I mean, I was very lucky, and that worked out well for us. But really, you show great respect by finding the common ground and developing those relationships before you need them. And then I think when you do that, the potential for the media to be an incredible resource is almost limitless. Nobody gets information out as well as they do, because that's what they do. So we should really learn to take advantage and to work in collaboration much more. When you see bad behaviour, you should call it out. When people are doing things that aren't helpful, then we should name that, and we should have a problem with it. But where there's an opportunity to work respectfully and collaboratively, I think there's a lot to be gained by doing that.
I think you've hit the nail on the head with so much of what can make emergency management and disaster resilience effective, and that really is trusted relationships and building those relationships early and collaborating and working together, working in partnership, working hand in hand, you know, toward a common goal or a common outcome, or just muddling through as you sometimes have to do, particularly in the heat of the moment, as it were. Great reflections, Anne, and lots of comments have come through saying thank you, and what a great story. So thank you for sharing. I'm just thinking over your career, you know, not only in the past 10 or 12 years, but prior to that, and thinking about mentors in your life. And I know that you're playing a mentoring role through drama and other organisations. But have you had mentors in your life that have helped you and supported you along the way?
Yes, I have had lots of people, and I mean, that's been one of the most incredibly humbling and powerful things about this work, I think. You know, we don't often, in fact, I don't know that I could even ever give an example of someone in the emergency management sphere that was intending to make things worse. You know, everyone is incredibly well motivated in this sector, and I think that's a real strength that we have to draw on. You know, the people that we work with and the people we work for, the people we report to, the people we're serving in the community, all want the same outcome, really, which is the best possible outcome for communities. So that's a very, very strong place to start. I was really very privileged to work for Bruce Esplin, who was the former Emergency Services Commissioner in Victoria, and long before we had fires, the fires in 2009, we had what we thought were pretty bad fires back in 2007, and I was helping council to coordinate a little bit of the recovery work, and Bruce came up to our community, or actually up to a community near us in Yea, and I got a message through saying the Emergency Services Commissioner is coming to Yea. Can you please find some people that would like to speak to him about the way the fires have been, you know, managed and what's occurred. And so I put together a group of people, some who were pretty happy with the way things had gone, some who were very unhappy. And I watched Bruce work with them over the course of an afternoon, and I watched him listening deeply and compassionately to each of their stories. And it was like each person that spoke to him, it was like he'd never heard that story before. Like it was just, he was so engaged with what they were telling him. And then at the end, he would offer this reassurance that in fact he had heard those things before, and that he'd heard them about this fire from other people, and that then he would tell that person what he thought the emergency services would be able to do in order to, you know, to improve for next time. And then at the end he'd say, so now what are you going to do differently next time? And you'd see people like, me? Yes. What will you do? What have you learned from this? You know, and so it was just a really remarkable experience. And so I remember thinking, I don't know who that bloke is, but he's a pretty good guy. And so I kind of, you know, put that in the back of my mind. Although he did, before he left, he said, what are you going to do now? You know, so you're doing some good work, but how is this going to be just anything more than a series of good ideas? You know, what are you going to do? And that kind of really challenged me. And so I decided to enrol in a Masters of Social Science. That was kind of the outcome of that, and that was a great adventure because I didn't have an undergraduate degree, so I'd never been to university in my life except for the very first time I went, and for quite a long time I thought people were making up words because I didn't actually understand a lot of what was going on. I didn't know a lecture from a tutorial from you know, anything else. So, but the happy thing for me was I met in my very first class the lecturer, Dr. Adrian Howe, and she was and is a remarkably intelligent, very grouchy, fiercely feminist woman whose challenge to the course was, I expect you to produce a publishable paper. That's what you have to do in my class, you know, and it has to be 4,000 words long, and your whole assessment will be on that one paper. So, you know, get with it. And I was terrified. And so I wrote a paper, and I was standing with it, about to post it in the slot, thinking, I have no idea whether this is good or terrible, whether I'll pass or fail. I was completely outside of my lived experience in terms of knowing how it would go. She emailed me a couple of weeks after I'd handed it in and said, look, I think it is publishable and I think you should submit it to a policy journal. And I said to her, do you know which student this is? Like, I'm the drought Anne, I'm not the other Anne. And she said, I know who you are. Like, of course I know who you are, you know. And I was so certain that she must have got mixed up, because I was so shocked that was her assessment. So there was a whole lot of lessons that came out of that. And one is, you know more than you think. Sometimes you have to just back yourself a bit. The other was just the tremendous value of that particular course and its ability to inspire critical thinking. And I remember at one point thinking, you know, I used to know stuff and now I don't know anything. And that was kind of my my turning point, I guess, in terms of not taking things for granted and really trying to think about things in a more critical way. So I've had the advantage of having some really great influences. And then after 2009, I actually got the chance to go and work at the Office of the Emergency Services Commissioner with Bruce and his team. And that was just extraordinary. And it was challenging because I'd never worked in Melbourne. I hardly ever used to go to Melbourne, maybe once a year for the ballet or something. So to find myself in there working every day on the 23rd floor of 121 exhibition was a big culture shock. But it was just such a remarkable experience. And so at that time, just prior to that time, really, I decided I would try and say yes to things. I was asked to speak about a paper I had written as part of my master's, actually for the OESC at an EMPA conference back in 2009. And so I went along and I was terrified. I'd never done any public speaking, and I felt very presumptuous to be presenting in a research stream with my one little research paper on the role of communities in disasters and communication. But it went okay, and then someone who saw that, who was from the Public Relations Institute of Australia, then said, would I come up and present the same paper to their conference in Queensland? And I thought no, but I said yes. And so then someone who was in the audience of Priya rang and said, well, we saw that thing, would you come and I said, you know, yeah, okay. And the reason I decided to do that is because I remember all the stories of the people in our community, and I thought this needs to go somewhere. You know, we can't have people go through these experiences without being able to share what it means and what it looks like and how hard it is and what needs to happen. And so, yeah, for a few years, well, quite a few years, I just said yes to everything. That led to some unexpected experiences and some pretty challenging experiences, but it also meant that I met the most amazing people and have learned from, just giants in the field of emergency management.
It certainly doesn't seem like you shy away from a challenge, Anne. If anything, I would suggest that you rise to the challenge every time. And how fabulous is that? I really love your advice about, well, not so much your advice, but your experiences of saying yes to things can really lead you to places that you never thought that you might be able to go.
Indeed.
And reveal capacities in yourself that you never knew you had. It certainly worked for me throughout my career, and I can certainly hear how it's worked for you. We are getting close to running out of time. We're getting lots of comments coming through saying, I hear you, Anne, I really relate to what you're saying. This is great. I love your stories. And I know that if we had the opportunity, we could sit and talk with you all night long. What I'm going to do is give a couple of minutes for people to share any burning questions that they've got. But before we do wrap up, I'm going to give a bit of a plug for our next conversation series, which is coming up on November the 19th. That will be with Associate Professor Val Ingham from Charles Sturt University, and our very own Lisa from our executive committee at OAR will be leading that conversation, and we're very much looking forward to that. So make sure you keep that date free and tune in when you can. So what have I got here? I've got a comment from somebody called Amanda saying, Anne, when I started in EM, I had a quote from you pinned up on my desk, and I'm grateful now to call you a friend. So thank you very much, Amanda, and I can see lots of smiles and nodding faces.
Anne's heard me tell that story very many times, but I can't resist because she's so embarrassed by it.
And you are an extraordinary woman. You are an absolute inspiration to many. And I know that a lot of your experience and your wisdom has been born of experience, direct experience, of lived experience. And the fact that you're willing to share that and to continue to share so generously with communities and with people right around Australia is absolutely phenomenal. We salute you as a fellow woman in emergencies. We thank you so much for coming along today and sharing some of your wisdom and your insights with us. And we absolutely hope that you can join us again one day in the future at an event like this, or very possibly an event in person, if anyone can even remember what those are like. Thank you everybody for making the time to tune in tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being members of the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. We are an amazing network of amazing women. Just looking at the faces and the names and the roles here on the screen today, I've got goosebumps. I'm absolutely thrilled to see everybody here. Really hope to see you all at the next conversation series. Don't forget, you can email us with any of your queries, send us an email or a personal message, and we'll get in touch with you. If you've got great ideas about what OAR can do for you or can do for its members, please let us know. And Anne, thank you so much again. You're a wonder.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Thank you, everybody. We'll say good night.